My book is in the copy editing stages, which is the worst part of the whole process. And like, I'm very emotional about it. And I would never have written the book if John in particular hadn't encouraged me to teach a class on climate change from the humanities perspective. And if I hadn't taught it here, the things that I have learned through teaching that class, through trying to make it better, through trying to respond to student interests, has profoundly shaped my own thinking. And the other thing I think in some ways that has shaped me the most being here is working in Africa Town. And as I talk about it today, I could have never done that without the students. I would have never had the courage to drive 1,000 miles by myself and just show up in a community where I didn't really know anyone. We'd been invited by one person that I had made contact with. I could never have done that by myself. And now it's 6 years into the relationship, and my students have really powerful, beautiful relationships with that community. So it's good to be here. It's good to see new potential environmental studies majors and other people. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, actually. All right. So what I want to do today, and I'm trying, it's always hard, you want to pack everything in, but what I really want to do is talk a little bit about where I see the environmental humanities fitting into and contributing to environmental studies, but also to talk a little bit about my own kind of approach to environmental justice. There's many, many different ways to think about environmental justice, so I want to share the one with you that I have been developing while I've been here. So these are two things that I like to use to sort of frame when I start talking about environmental justice. So I'm going to do that at the beginning of this talk. The first one on the upper right, that is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is in Montgomery, Alabama. It's run by was created by the Equal Justice Initiative. If you've heard of their work, they mainly do work against mass incarceration and the death penalty in Alabama. It's 2 hours north of Africa Town. So that's why my students and I stopped there on our way down to Africa Town in 2018. And what it is a testament to, or a witness to, a memorial to, are the more than 4,000 people, Black people, who were lynched in the United States before 1972. They stopped counting there. And those are only the ones they've been able to document. So part of that to me is about the issues of how we need to think about history. When we talk about environmental studies, in history, I think of as a more humanistic discipline to understand how these ideological and social structures continue to influence our thinking and our perceptions of the world. And then on the other side there's a beautiful book that I teach and I recommend called Farming While Black. It's by Leah Penniman. And she talks about the sort of powerful and difficult and beautiful legacy of farming in Black communities in the United States, starting with the fact that people who were enslaved were talented farmers, which is why they were brought here, to the ways that agricultural labor was a site of torture and exploitation, as well as spirituality and healing for enslaved peoples and into the present for Black Americans. And this is a beautiful, beautiful painting of the actual practice that's been documented, which is that African women, when they knew that they were being brought to the slave ships, would braid seeds into their hair so that they could bring them with them to this unknown world, and believing in as this painting says, believing in the future and finding ways to feed themselves and their loved ones in this place that they had never seen. So the thing that's striking to me about this painting is that it's so beautiful. And I worry when I talk only about environmental racism that is a very kind of reductive way to think about any group. But if you only think about pain or reaction to oppression or the bad things that have happened to a group of people. So I just want to put out there that it's always going to be more complicated, and that nature and the non-human have been a source of life and love and spirituality and healing and growth for many different peoples all through history and into the present. So talking a little bit about the humanities to start with. As Jog was saying at the beginning, environmental studies is often kind of called a problem-solving discipline. And there are a lot of problems that need to be solved. And the humanities tend to be a little less useful, I would say, in that project. We're better at thinking about things, about asking questions, and about talking about values. So I think that there obviously is so much overlap or so many places of connection between the humanities and the other disciplines in environmental studies. And I actually see that, I feel like we're seeing that a lot now, that we're seeing a common ground in certain ways in the United States among people who say, we actually think we need to understand science. We need to understand the science of pandemics. We need to understand the science of climate change. We need to pay attention to science, because if we don't, we can end up in a worse place. So that is, I think, a meeting place where I'm seeing a lot of people kind of saying that right now, which is helpful. That science needs to inform our decisions, even if it can't make our decisions for us. And what I mean by that is that science can answer the question of whether climate change is happening. That's a scientific question to be answered through scientific methods and empirical studies. But when we start saying, well, what do we do about climate change? It might seem obvious or self-evident. It might seem like, well, science will tell us stop producing so much carbon. Yes. But then we start asking, well, who bears the how do we do that? If we start telling people in developing nations that they cannot use, that they have to reduce their carbon emissions, what impacts can that have? What does equity look like when we say carbon emissions need to be reduced? Those are the kinds of questions that someone in environmental ethics will ask. They say, well, who's going to bear the burden of that? How are you going to decide which projects are brought in and which ones are left behind? How are you going to decide how industrialized nations pay the debt of climate, pay their carbon debt? You have the fact that burning coal in England, burning coal in London, that caused the London fog that is so famous during the industrial era, is now contributing to flooding in Bangladesh. But no one knew that at the time. So how do you handle harms that are, you can't attach them to one individual or another. You can't say when exactly they happened. You can't actually tease out the synergistic effects of these different forms of fossil fuel use. How do you think through the ethical questions of that? How do you say, what does it mean to be responsible to and responsible for past harms that were possibly unintentional and that are having ongoing effects into the present? Those are the kinds of questions that a humanities person asks. This is from a guy named Dale Jamieson, and I think it's really helpful because very often I feel like when we start to talk about values, people get anxious, and it's understandable because we have a very hostile kind of public dialogue at the moment, where when people start to talk about their beliefs or their political ideas, it can get ugly really fast in the public sphere, in the blogosphere. But I think it's really important to be able to look at values and talk about them. And there are some ways that values are not the same things as what somebody might say preferences or even beliefs, I think, and we can talk a little bit about that. Because when people say, well, your preferences are just sort of subjective and irrational, and there's really not a way to talk about that. But if we think that values are something that we hold because we have reasons for them, that makes them different from a preference. So the example I often use is that I'm like, I absolutely prefer chocolate ice cream to vanilla or to fruit, any kind of fruit ice cream. That's a preference. That's something I enjoy. It's basically a subjective question. But if you start asking questions like, where was that cocoa grown? And what were the workers paid who grew that cocoa? And how do you feel about eating chocolate if you know it was produced by enslaved labor, essentially enslaved labor right now in Africa at this time? Then you might feel a little bit differently about eating chocolate ice cream. So that's where you start to get into a question of values. It's not a value about whether you like chocolate ice cream or not, but it's a value when you start to choose whether you're only going to buy fair trade chocolate, or whether you're going to decide that you need to go vegan because you don't want to support, industrialized farming. Those are values questions. Those are things we can talk about, and those are things that we can have reasons for, and those are things that people may change their minds over time in a way that they won't simply for a preference. So this is one of the slides I show just for us to think about labor. When we talk about environmental issues, labor is a really key ethical issue. And so it's one thing to sort of say, I like strawberry ice cream. It's another thing to ask, well, where do your strawberries come from? So one is a preference, another is a question of values. Thinking about environmental racism and environmental justice from a humanities perspective, one of the key aspects for me and just the way that I was trained and the way that I think about environmental justice is I always start with communities. And that's because the environmental justice movement for a long time has said, we speak for ourselves. So listening to communities and placing community choices and community agency at the center of struggles for environmental justice is really key to me. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of my journey since getting here and to Oberlin, and how my thinking about environmental justice has developed in conversation with communities and my students and my fellow faculty. So just really quickly, the way environmental justice is often talked about is that it is thought of in terms of distributive justice and procedural justice. And so distributive justice, if you can kind of go back to the root with distribution or distribute, it's about making sure that benefits and burdens are equally shared out. So the idea is that if a community is bearing the burdens of some kind of industry, it should also receive the benefits from that industry, the income that's generated by that industry, for example. This does not happen, in case you were wondering. It doesn't work that way, but that's the ideal. Procedural justice is really about democratic process. It's about the idea that everyone who is affected by a decision should have a say in that decision. It might seem sort of self-evident, but once again, it's not the way it works out most of the time. Probably a lot of you are familiar with Standing Rock and the fact that the indigenous nations who were living near where the pipeline was going to be a mile or less from where the pipeline was going to be put through, and it was crossing their ancestral lands, which had never been ceded through a treaty, they were not included in the decision-making process. That was part of why it came to this blockade, because communities had to use direct action because they had been cut out of the decision-making process prior to that. Corrective justice is something I want to include in the context of climate change in particular. Corrective justice is basically the idea that there should be a payment of debt. And so when industrialized nations, when we talk about industrialized nations having contributed to, especially the West and the US, historically contributing the most to greenhouse gases, the question is, well, how do you calculate out the debt for that? And then how does it get distributed and paid? But I want us today, and the reason they're not defined is that this is the things I want us to talk about. Decolonial justice and reparative justice. Decolonial justice is language that mainly comes out of Indigenous and Native American communities. So thinking about colonization, and in particular about settler colonialism. So settler colonialism is distinct in that it is what we see in the United States, or in Canada and Mexico, which is European settlers moving in and displacing the indigenous peoples who were there through genocide, through warfare, through the reservation system, and other means. When we say settler colonialism, it implies that kind of inhabiting and ongoing colonialism. And one way to think of a contrast to this is India. So India was colonized also by Britain, but it was not settler colonialism. It was a few British people who were living there, exploiting the labor and the goods and the products that were produced by people who lived there, deriving wealth from India, but then the British got kicked out, right? But the settlers in the United States have never been kicked out. So that's why we'd say that settler colonialism is ongoing. You know what's nice about not wearing a mask is I can take a drink. And the last thing I want to talk about is reparative justice. And by reparative, what I mean is taking up a reparations framework. But we will come back to that in a little bit. First, I want us to focus in on decolonization and decolonial justice within environmental justice. So here we are, the Great Lakes. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, so not around here. And I started to learn a little bit about this area after moving here. And one of the things I learned was that 1/5 or 20% of the world's surface freshwater, so just at the surface, is here in the Great Lakes, which is phenomenal. It's when you think about it on a global level. So what this means to me is that in a just society, in an environmentally just society, anyone who's living here should not lack access to water. And should not lack access to safe water and to clean water, which is what it was like before settler colonials got here. But what happens is that water has become a commodity, which means that it's now something that gets bought and sold within a capitalist framework. And that has had a lot of different environmental justice impacts and will continue to even more so under climate change. So in 2013, the city of Detroit was put under emergency management. And what that means is that instead of having a democratically elected leader, someone was appointed by the governor to put the state through austerity measures and budget cuts and to try to balance the budget. And so one of the things that started was that water got shut off to people in the city of Detroit who were behind on their bills. And so a couple of things, and I'm sure you all can imagine this, is that when people are not paying their water bills, it's because they're having to make difficult choices, right? Do you pay water? Do you pay heat? Do you pay groceries? If you have a car, do you put gas in the car so you can get to work? And shutting off people's water who are unable to pay their bills has a whole cascade of effects. And I think it's actually really important to recognize the kind of psychological traumas that can come with it if someone is not able to bathe, if they're not able to do their laundry, if they can't bathe their children and do their children's laundry, the kinds of shame and pain that come with that. If people can't cook for themselves because there's no water, then they're spending more money on food. And if children get sent to school and they're dirty and their clothes are dirty, then people are going to start getting labeled as unfit parents. So it's not just the idea that someone was behind on a bill and had to pay up on their bill. It's the kinds of destructive impacts that these policies have in a place where there's no reason anyone should be without water, right? By the way, water in Detroit is very expensive. It's about, when I looked back at this, when this was happening in 2013, water was selling for about 3 times what I was paying for it here in Orland. There's another way that water in the Great Lakes has been privatized, and that is through pollution, through an environmental justice issue, which is lead pipes. And I know that there is current activism going on in Cleveland around lead pipes. There's lead pipes, as far as I know, all through the Midwest, the upper Midwest, which is a terrifying thought. So some of you may have heard that this was in 2014, that it was discovered that switching the source of water for the city of Flint meant that the pipes began to corrode, and lead. And also, I was just teaching this in my environmental repair class, Legionnaire's disease, which is actually it's not a disease in the sense of, it's actually a bacterial infection. So Legionnaire's disease is spread by bacteria in water when it becomes airborne, like when someone takes a shower. There was also an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in Flint, as well as lead in the water, which has long-term detrimental effects on children's development. People in Flint still don't have safe water. They're still drinking bottled water. So this is another example of privatization, in the sense that if you're a wealthy person and you're living in a place where the water isn't safe, you could move away, right? Or maybe you can afford to buy yourself bottled water, although, bottled water the safety of that is questionable a lot of the time. But to this date, as far as I know, there still has not been justice for the people of Flint. There was, I thought, this really interesting kind of theater of the oppressed, public theater that was done where people held a tribunal from Flint and they put these officials, who of course didn't show up, on trial for their crimes. So when we think about in a society where people don't get justice, what are some of the ways that we approach this, and try to demand it and try to envision what justice would look like? And these kinds of public actions, I think, are one way. So during the time when the Detroit water shuts were happening, and the second next summer too, was Flint. So 2013, I went on a 2013, I went on a great field trip with my students to Detroit, and we met with the Detroiters working for Eastern Michigan Environmental Justice Action Coalition and some other people, Auntie Nay and some other community organizers. And one of the places that we were brought by some of the environmental justice activists was this place, the Marathon Petroleum Processing Plant. So this is in the most polluted zip code in Detroit, which is saying a lot because Detroit has a lot of environmental justice issues. And what I found out when I was on this field trip was that, this is an African-American neighborhood, was that this particular power plant, processing plant, was processing tar sands oil. And I didn't really know what that was, so I got online and I started learning a little bit about it. Tar sands oil, and I don't know how easy. I can't really get sadly, I can't get my little arrow to appear. Must have something to do with the screen share. But if you can go up into the left and see where Fort McMurray is. Fort McMurray is one of the locations of the Alberta tar sands, which is one of the largest deposits on the planet of tar sands. It's this you've probably heard some about it. It's a very polluting form of petroleum, a fossil fuel. It's got worse carbon emissions than regular petroleum. And it is very, very destructive to mine because they essentially do open pit mines. So I was like, okay, so this is where the tar sands are coming from. And they're getting shipped down. If you can locate our Great Lakes there, they're getting shipped down to the Great Lakes to be processed. At one point, the largest tar sands processing facility was here in Ohio in Toledo. I don't know if it's still the largest. So while I was online, I saw an invitation to go to something called the Tar Sands Healing Walk. And so it was an invitation to allies to show up and to participate in a ceremonial action, which was walking and praying. And for me, this was like the kind of thing I feel very, very drawn to. So I said, I'm just gonna go. And so I booked myself a ticket and I went up to the Tar Sands Healing Walk, where I had never been up there before, and participated in this walk, which I'll show a little video of later. And it was incredibly powerful. And it was incredibly difficult to see the level of destruction that had been done to these indigenous lands, also not ceded through treaty, the destruction of this boreal forest, and the amount of pollution that was being created, and the destruction of people's livelihoods. So a lot of the indigenous communities up there were continuing practices of hunting and fishing, and the tar sands were poisoning the water. The tar sands industry is poisoning the water, poisoning the air. There were a rise in strange cancers, both in animals and in fish and in humans. So it was very, very difficult to witness that. And then the second year I went back in 2014. And when I was there in 2014, I met these elders from Africatown, Miss May and Miss Louise, and also Ramsey, who's an indigenous organizer who lives in Africatown now. They were there at the Tar Sands Healing Walk to show solidarity because their community had been targeted for tar sands projects, basically. There is a pipeline now that runs through the school athletic yard. and there was a proposed tar sands tank storage facility, which they fought off. So I had never heard the story of Africatown when I got there. And what I learned was that the last ship of enslaved people to be brought to the United States landed in Africatown, or what was Mobile. This was in 1860, so just before the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. It was after the slave trade had been declared illegal. So it was illegal in addition to being wrong. But there were no consequences for the white people who did it. But what you see with Africatown is a pattern, and we'll talk more about this in the context of reparations, where these free Black towns, which are small, have over time, all through the Gulf Coast, been surrounded by polluting facilities. And a big part of this is that white landowners, as the plantation system became less and less profitable, were looking for other ways to make money off of that land. And heavy industry, petrochemical industry, is one of the profitable ways to make money when you have land. So I'm actually gonna, escape out of this because I wanna show you a video. I think I might have to stop the share because I'm always a little confused about how these things work. Okay.
I did make you a co-host. I don't know if that helps you with like pointing and stuff like that.
Okay, thanks. I feel like it was just, I just didn't quite know how to switch John to the YouTube channel. That's all. Okay. So what I want to show you here, everyone, is a video that was taken by a group called Idle No More, which is an indigenous group that is focused on resurgence and environmental justice and decolonization. This is a really beautiful film, I feel. And so what I'd like you to do is to be short. It's like 4 minutes. As you're watching this, we talked about environmental justice and the idea of distributive justice and procedural justice. And I mentioned corrective justice too. And if we think about decolonial justice, what does that mean? So if we think about decolonization meaning for settler colonial cultures, means maybe giving land back or giving control of land back to indigenous nations. It means recognizing and honoring the treaties that have been made. But what I love about this video is I think it describes a decolonial or a decolonized future and in ideas about what decolonization and decolonial justice would look like for indigenous and First Nations peoples. So I just want you to watch this, sort of see what stands out to you. And then I want us to have a conversation just about what seemed important and really like valuable and what people were saying and what they're describing. And we'll use that as a way to start talking about what decolonial justice could look like.
The healing walk is many things for many people. For me, it's about prayer, and it's about paying respect to the ancestors.
When we were walking, we stopped and prayed at four separate locations. The women who were leading the walk, the First Nations women, they prayed and they offered tobacco and water. This fight against natural energy extraction, it's all connected, it's all related, and it's all affecting Indigenous people. And I never realized that until I came up here, that it stretches all the way up here to Fort McMurray, Canada.
This is the province that's benefiting, supposedly, from the oil refineries, supposedly from oil leaving. And everybody's working in some capacity, and they're employed in some capacity and gaining materially from the ripping and tearing apart of our lands and our waters. And so it's difficult to get people to realize and to give up what they believe is the good life. And I tell people, you know, you come to this land of plenty. Your land of plenty is our land of demise. you are killing us with your greed.
Healing is an important process for us as Indigenous communities, a process that has to be continual. And part of that healing is being here at the Tar Sands Healing Walk in Fort McMurray, speaking about the effects of this industrial project on communities, not only in this area, but literally across Turtle Island. That healing is so important for us in moving forward. And I see that healing reflect back in the healing that we also need to be doing around addressing, the many different women that have been murdered and have gone missing. The violence that's happening on the land is directly connected to the violence happening on our bodies.
It'll be overwhelming to, I said, we're protecting the water, but in actuality, no, protecting the water, because we can't be there for every person, is doing something, every, company that's going in there. But the water is so powerful. We're not protecting the water, my friend said. She was taught. She said, we're standing behind the water. And we are walking with the power of the water.
We're trying to draw lines of connection to those communities that are fighting the pipelines across the continent of North America, whether it be Energy East, Clipper, Northern Gateway, or the Keystone XL pipeline. We feel that it's absolutely imperative that we draw the connections back to the source and make those alliances and create those relationships to foster the strength and unity of the struggle.
Okay, so I realize that there's a lot of people here and I might not see everyone at the same time, but I think that it makes sense for us to maybe try to talk as a group. But what I would like to do first is just break you quickly into breakout groups, into the breakout rooms, and so that you can talk to each other for a minute, because I think it's easier sometimes when to start talking in a small group, and then we'll try to come back and have a discussion for all this. So again, just as I said before, maybe just talk about some of the things that stood out to you in this video, what themes you noticed, and what it means around decolonization and environmental justice. So let's see. John, can you help me out? Can we break?
Sure. How many people do you want per group?
You think like around 3 or 4?
Okay.
And thank you. John and I will stay here. You all can come back whenever you want, but we'll send a message to you in a little bit. So a couple
I'm going to
minutes.
recreate, and let's see.
For some reason, it's not. It was just not.
Well, it's because I sort of preset up rooms, but I think I got it.
Random is fine too.
Yeah, that's what we'll do. Yeah. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry. Darn it. I screwed up. Hold on, I'll get it again. Why am I having problems here? Sorry. It's going to take a minute before it stops these things. I created rooms that were too big accidentally.
Should have said something ahead of time. Sorry. I haven't been teaching on Zoom this semester, so I'm kind of out of practice now.
Right. We're not normally doing it, although we do use it for groups, but I pre-created these groups and actually it won't, it's going to take 21 seconds. So think about that. Just reflect for the next 16 seconds. So go ahead and join the room you've been assigned to. And Jay, we'll have to we can just stay here.
We'll hang out here in the big room. It's so funny, like concepts of space and things, on how conceptually on Zoom. I had a student who missed class today because I should tell you this. I had Lisette. Lisette
Really?
Loren Skype into my class, Zoom into my class she's in Japan right now, doing work on her PhD on her dissertation.
Right.
So we met on Zoom, even though we don't usually, because I actually think it's better and that, when someone's remote. And it was like a student was like, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong room. Like I forgot what time it was, and then I went at the wrong room and I couldn't find the right room. And it was, sort of funny.
Well, how is Lisette?
She's good. Although, she was saying, like today in class, she said, when I was an undergraduate, I was in Japan for a year and I was here for the Fukushima disaster. And now I'm back here and I got here in fall 2019 and it's the middle of a global pandemic. So she's just like, I was like, they said they're not gonna let you come back anymore.
Yeah.
She's really been, she's been there for two terrible disasters now,
Yeah. How's she doing though? How's her dissertation going?
It looks really good, actually. She's kind of, she's in science and technology studies, which is so interdisciplinary. And I think she's learned a lot there. And she's really interested in kind of trying to put together, what she was talking about today was what it's called nuclear tourism, which is a weird language for it, but it's about people who want to go and visit these sites as a kind of, a kind of ceremony, kind of pilgrimage is the language she was using. And she's kind of looking at that together with what she calls peace culture and the idea of trying to find nonviolent alternatives, both in terms of like nuclear weapons, but also in terms of environmental justice, like energy sources that don't cause violence. So it's rich, it's powerful. And she has the kind of experience from having been there as an undergrad and then lived there as a Chauncey fellow and now being back there again. I think it's going to be great.
How much more time does she? I'm losing track of when she graduated. That must have been like 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, she graduated in 2012, but then she worked for at least 4 years, I think. She probably started her grad program maybe in 2017 because she's now finished up her coursework. I think they had 2 years of coursework in 2019 was going to do language study. And like the thing I was reading was her like sort of a PhD proposal. It wasn't quite, she's not yet doing the PhD research. So I'm guessing 2016 or 2017 is when she started. Probably 2016. So
I totally lose track of who graduates when. I still can't keep. I think people should know each other. These students who you just feel like they're kindred souls. They should know each other, and like they didn't overlap at all. But it's like they should still know each other.
I know. And it's really something that now, I'm sure you've experienced this even more than I have, but I'm like, oh, wow. Like my students who graduated when I first got here are now like in their 30s.
I know that is really quite crazy. Yeah. Who they have like children and yeah.
How that happened.
Right. Yeah.
How is your semester going?
It's okay. Yeah, I think it's going as well as it could.
Right.
Yeah, I feel good I feel like this class is going well, and I'm having them do lots of interviews of students and community people, and it's I feel like that connection is a good thing, and I feel like it's working. I don't completely sure. I think most of the feedback I get is that it's working for them to sort of like, because they're so like disconnected, especially the first years. It's just so
hard.
Like the normal thing is just it's just counterpoint to the reality.
Rough. It's just rough. It is. Like, I think the seniors are managing and a lot of them are living off campus and they have therefore like kitchens and some normal, some normal kinds of interactions. And I think for the first years, it's really rough. And it's rough for the juniors.
Yeah.
All of the juniors in the practicum were like, I'm depressed this week.
Right.
And I'm like, you've been home a long time, sitting in your room.
Yeah.
Typing on Zoom or working as a grocery check or whatever.
Yeah.
So do you think could we send them that one?
Sure, let's do that. Let's see. Should we just, why don't I just close all room? That'll
Yeah,
give
just
them a
close them
minute.
and it'll
Yeah,
send that
okay.
little message, right, that says you got one. Oh, and there they come back. One teacher is Charles Peterson. He always has cool music playing, so you don't have these.
That he does. That he does.
Okay, it looks like everyone's popping back in. So just briefly, I would really be interested. I know it can be really awkward, but I would really be interested if people could just kind of share back a little bit of what you talked about. You should just feel free to unmute yourself, but if you want to put yourself in any kind of queue, you could put it in the chat, and that way we can all kind of see it. So feel free to start out, just wherever, unmute yourself and share back what you noticed, what you talked about in your group.
Well, I want to share from my group. My name's Noel Govashir, and something that we had discussed in our group, although it was more of it was like 2 steps ahead of this. It was like as an extension of what we watched. We were talking about what really is the impact of marches compared to these grand organizations and politicians who could just turn the other cheek. Obviously, they're to bring awareness, of course, but then if once the awareness is brought to, though, and there's clear attention that, like, hey, this is what we do not want. We do not want you to build a pipeline here. We do not want you to invest in this or that. The politician or the person in power has a total right to just be like, no. I just wonder what really is the impact of marches and how far. Something I also thought about was, okay, perhaps that also goes hand in hand with boycotts. But then how do you, this is a hypothetical situation, how do you boycott something like water for Flint?
So a quick response to that would be, in a way you're saying, how does a march help us to solve the problem, right? And I think that I would again sort of back us up a little bit and say, what happens at something like the Healing Walk? So for me, what happened to the Healing Walk was that I showed up not knowing what was going to happen, thinking maybe I would collaborate with some Indigenous peoples who live, First Nations live there. And instead, I've fallen in love with the community of African. I've worked with them for 6 years. So I think we don't know sometimes what the results will be, what the impacts will be of these kinds of gatherings. I also feel like, and if we have time, I can talk about this a little bit too. I feel like one of the things that's really important to recognize is that there are these moments where there's something like Standing Rock. This is something Nick Estes says in his book, Our History is the Future. And what he says is there are these moments like Standing Rock or the Healing Walk or a Black Lives Matter protest where everyone suddenly says, oh my God, look at this. People who weren't aware of it before say, oh, there's a pipeline. And it's endangering people's water. Or, oh, Black people are being murdered in the streets and there's no accountability. Like, what do we do about that? I have a lot of white family members whose awareness has been raised by Black Lives Matter. And what Nick Estes says is, yes, there are these moments where these long histories of resistance and resurgence come into view, like at a march, but that what actually sustains change, social change and resistance and survival and resurgence is everyday life. It's the things people are doing in everyday life that are really critical and that aren't as obvious and are harder to uncover, but are just as important if we're thinking about revolution. There are moments of direct action. There's moments where you blockade and you try to stop something and maybe it doesn't work, but that doesn't mean the movement ends. that everyday revolution is still going on. And that's one of the reasons I love, for example, if I've done some work with urban gardening communities in Cleveland. And to me, that's one of the most sort of radical spaces and decolonized spaces. And it's done through very simple things like growing food and sharing it and cooking and eating together, which is everyday life. So that's me. I'd like to hear what other people talked about in your groups. It's so hard when you're staring at a screen of faces.
I know in our group we kind of talked about how colonialism and the idea of using the environment sort of respectfully sort of don't go hand in hand in a way, just in the way that you look at how Indigenous people sort of respect that they respect the land they're living on. They're very sustainable in the way that they treat the land and the animals and the water and everything they use there. It's very respectful in a way that they're aware that they need to take care of this land because this is where they live, and there's a symbiotic relationship where one can't really thrive without the other. So then it sort of takes a turn when you introduce colonialism and these people show up and they're like, well, you're doing it wrong, you're not expanding, and you're not like trading or doing all this stuff. And they show up and they do this. They just sort of try and turn it into something that it doesn't need to be. And then we look at it now and we're like, maybe they were doing it right all along. So,
yeah. Yeah. And some of what you're identifying there, I think, is values again, which is a value of reciprocity, and maybe kind of a value of nonviolence in terms of human relationships with the non-human world, finding modes that are reciprocal and beneficial to both people and to the land. Any other things from the video, from the short film?
One of the things that I think like demonstrated really well in the video is sort of the importance of, with issues like this and movements like this, following and listening to the community that has been affected and that is advocating. Like you could see in the healing walk, like everyone was walking behind the Indigenous women who were leading it. And I think that sort of demonstrates in a really like succinct visual manner, like need to listen to the people that these problems are affecting, because they know intimately what the problems are because they're living it.
Exactly. And frequently know things before anyone who's a so-called expert. That's one of the things, if you read about Flint, people from the very moment the water was changed, the source of the water was changed, started saying it smells bad, it tastes bad, it's a weird color, I'm getting rashes. They started reporting symptoms of the fact that the water was contaminated right away. But they were not listened to.
Yeah, adding on to Emma's point, because for these people, it's more than just a climate fight, but it's a fight for their land and their water, for human rights and like for their culture, and so the decolonization aspect was really evident in this video.
Yeah.
Because it's their land, and yeah, for these Indigenous people.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I've heard different Indigenous and First Nations activists say is I'm not an environmentalist. What really matters to me is sovereignty, is having control over our land, having our traditional territories back, being safe to practice our indigenous ways of life and that kind of thing. So it ends up having environmental benefits or having environmental protections that come with it, but it can't be reduced to that. So we ended 8:20, right? So I want to just do a couple more, share a couple more slides, and then give us some more time to sort of talk at the end. Let's see. There it is. Okay. So we ended with this slide on environmental justice. What I want us to get to now is to talk a little bit about Africatown, real briefly, as a way to set up this question of reparations and environmental justice. So I mentioned that Africatown was founded in 1860. That the people who founded Africatown, who survived the No Passage, were brought in 1860. After emancipation, they first went to their enslaver, and this is documented in a book called Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, who is probably the first Black ethnographer. And they went to their enslaver, former enslaver, and said, "You should give us land in return for all the labor we've done." And he refused. So they bought their own. First, they tried to go back to Africa, actually, I should say, to their homelands. And then when they weren't able to do that, they asked for reparations. They were denied. And then they bought their own land and formed a school. These are, by the way, photos of New Orleans, not Africatown, and created a school and created a really thriving community. But the problem, this is a map of a part of the Mississippi River that's known as Cancer Alley by environmental justice advocates. And what you see here, what I really want to draw as clearly as I can, is the connection between the plantation system and these current situations of environmental racism. So what you have along here are former plantations, because plantations wanted to be on the river for easy access for shipping of cotton and sugar and indigo. And then after the Great Migration, when people were fleeing terrorism and lynching and white supremacy, and there was less labor, the plantation system was replaced, and it was replaced by these kinds of petrochemical industries. So all along here, you see these clusters of chemicals that are being produced on these former plantations. And then in between these former plantations, what you have are Black towns, sometimes formed as early as in the 1700s, sometimes formed later during Reconstruction as sanctuaries from terrorism. And these free Black towns over time have been surrounded by these polluting industries. And that's why, so this is Robert Bullard, who's like one of my environmental justice heroes. And he has done his work in New Orleans and in the Gulf Coast. And that's where the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice was formed. And we got to meet him in Africatown one year. But so looking at this landscape, which is so incredibly polluted, and if you start to learn the histories there and the current situation that people are facing, it's so heartbreaking. It's so obviously a form of environmental apartheid, that this is a landscape that is producing Black suffering and Black death. So when we talk about the plantations, enslavement not having ended and just being transformed into mass incarceration, the other kind of element I want to add to that is say, yes, enslavement has not ended, it's taken new forms. The plantation system hasn't ended, it's taken new forms. And this is the form that it's in right now. And it's the place where premature death and suffering are visited on Black bodies. But I'm always worried, like with my classes, that I end on really depressing notes. So what I want to end on here as I go through some of these slides is the fact that I still have faith in social movements and in direct action and in what happens when people come together. And this is an example of Indigenous peoples. That's Nick Estes on the left, holding the No Ban on Stolen Land poster. This is Indigenous peoples welcoming Muslim peoples to the United States. This is a statement that we here at Oberlin wrote in support of the water protectors at Standing Rock. And then I want to end here. Coming back to the idea of everyday life. And these are Maurice Small and Vel Scott, who are two of my mentors in the urban farming movement. These are the places where new worlds come into being. So I think change is possible. I think it's going to take a lot to have the kinds of changes that we need. But I think that decolonial and reparative frameworks point the way to us. That is not just about distributing benefits and burdens within capitalism and the status quo. It's about creating a better and more just society, which people know how to do. People know how to create better and more just societies. They just need the freedom to do it. This is a photo of Standing Rock. And to maybe come back around to the environmental humanities, and I'm going to stop talking. These are just, these are some more examples to me of temporary, utopias. This was organized, the Poor People's Campaign was organized by Martin Luther King. These are some photos from Standing Rock and the Occupy movement. And this is a word cloud that my students and I in my environmental, in the climate change class, when I was like, everyone talks about hope and despair. Like those are the only two options. Those are the only two ways that we have to kind of face climate change. But when we are in my class, we say, well, what are some of the other experiences that we have when we have joined with other people to try to create more just worlds? And there's a whole range of experiences that come from that. And when we talk about what are the results of these kinds of blockades and these kinds of direct actions and these kinds of communities that come together, and what is the result of living those solidarities out in our everyday life, there's lots of possibilities. For me, generosity and hospitality are really key, because that's what I've experienced in Africa Town. When my students and I show up in our van from Oberlin that broke down the first time we got there, we've been shown so much hospitality and so much generosity from the community, and sharing their stories with us through our oral history project. And that's where I find hope. So I'm going to stop the share there and open it up for whatever.
This isn't a question, but I think I saw a presentation from one of your students who went to Africa Town for the oral project last summer for undergraduate research.
Sounds likely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It might have been Avon Zimmer Chu.
That sounds familiar. I think so.
Student. Yep.
Yeah.
They were doing stuff on like utopian.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
2 summers. Yeah. 2 summers ago.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't remember much from, because
no, it's okay.
But it was super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. The students have been really amazing. They've done so much work on the project. In addition to that, they've done this kind of intangible, incredibly essential work of forming bonds of love and trust with the community. That's the place the students have been the most fundamental, I think, to the project.
I suppose I have a question, kind of an extension of what I said earlier.
Mhm.
So I asked about the extent of a march, and you said how the movement is not in there, and I acknowledge that. Thank you for that. I was wondering, and this probably does not have an answer since movements are so variable and
the humanities.
Yeah, there's really no end to what you may do. But I was wondering, do you think there's like a peak action that brings about the most change, or does that not really exist?
Yeah, I honestly, I just don't even know how I would how would you measure that, right? Like
Yeah,
what
of course.
actions? I think that there are certain strategies, right, that people have used. But if you look at like the civil rights movement, they always used a layered strategy. Yes, they were doing direct action. Yes, they were doing marches and sit-ins and boycotts. They were also working with the Supreme Court. They were also doing legislative. They were also doing voting rights campaigns and registration of voters. So it's like lots of different things that come together. I like focusing on direct action because those are the spaces that like I love to be a part of. But that doesn't mean that they're the only way to do things or even always the most effective. There's lots of options.
Mhm. Thank you. That was actually kind of the answer I was looking for. I was
Okay.
looking-
It's always nice to be able to like answer a question in the humanities. Usually we can't. Unanswerable questions. I can see that people are like thinking. Do you know what I mean? Like I could see that people are processing. So I'm going to talk a little bit, but I really want you to jump in. But just to kind of close a few thoughts, I mentioned the idea of like reparative justice and then the idea of reparations, and wanted to show the way that certain environmental justice landscapes, environmental racist landscapes, have their roots in the plantation system. The reason I like thinking about this in a framework of reparations is because it is so big. It takes into account the historical pieces. And to me, reparations involves so many things. It involves telling the truth and listening to people, which a couple people have already talked about today. It involves an apology, a sincere apology. I just had two of the elders from Africa Town speak to my environmental repair class, to our whole Studio C. And one of them said, one of them said, don't try to hand me a check. Don't just try to think that you can just hand me a check. You need to do more. You need to understand what happened and what repair means. Because after the apology, what happens next in a reparations process is some form of compensation, which can be monetary, but is not only that. And then the other elder said, anyone's handing out checks, I'm first in line. So lots of different opinions and possibilities of what reparations would look like. But monetary is certainly one piece of it. So truth-telling, apology, compensation, and then finally what's called sort of by legal scholars would be called non-repetition. What that really means is it doesn't do any good to apologize for doing something if you continue to do it. So if you're going to apologize, you also have to commit to making the changes necessary to stop doing those harms. So that's the social change piece. And of course, really in a reparations process, you're never going to complete any one of those things. You're going to be doing them all the time. And so some people are working on truth telling. That's where I see our oral history project actually fitting in. Some people are working on social change. There are people who've written long, important books about what financial compensation would look like for enslavement. So that's when we put environmental justice in a reparations context. It shows how just saying distributing benefits and burdens in the present is really inadequate. When we look at that landscape of Cancer Alley, I have no idea what environmental remediation would even look like in that landscape and how much it would be possible. And even if you were, you couldn't make up for all of the deaths and suffering that have been produced by that landscape that have fueled the wealth of the United States and industrialization. So I'm going to stop talking again.
Do you have any recommendations for books? Like you mentioned that there were books that went into more detail about like financial reparations. Do you have any specific recommendations?
So there is a really interesting person who someday I hope we can get out here as a guest speaker. Her name, I'm putting it in the chat. Her name is Maxine Burkett. She is a Black woman who works on, in particular, she's at the University of Hawaii, and she works on reparations, both in the context of reparations for African Americans, but also in terms of climate reparations, thinking about island and indigenous communities, coastal communities. So her stuff is great. You probably all have heard like the new Jim Crow and Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, which I think are really good about tracing out the historical aspects of kind of our present structures. I'll think about that. The concept of reparations has sort of just started being talked about in environmental justice work. And unfortunately, a lot of what's been written about it is like either these very technical legal articles, like we're struggling through this in my repair class right now, or like these very complicated mathematical models of how you calculate stuff. So finding stuff that's sort of readable is a little harder, but I'll think about it in sense of John. John, I'm going to call on you. What are you thinking?
What am I thinking about? I'm actually thinking about reparations right now. And I mean, I'm just going to be perfectly honest. I feel like, you know, all of us, I think, are sort of evolving in our thinking about what's possible and what's right. And I feel as though reparations is one of these things that I initially started thinking about as not necessarily impossible from a moral standpoint, but impossible from like a societal standpoint. And I feel like, so as with so many things in our society, I feel movement on this. I feel like there's movement. I feel like it's an idea that seemed at one point, I mean, in the same way that an African-American president earlier in my life would have seemed like an impossibility, it feels like, no, this is an impossibility, or gay marriage, or all these other things that have sort of come to pass in my lifetime. I feel like, no, I can feel it as like something that could, not something that will happen, but something that could happen. We could get there, but it still feels like it's pretty far forward in terms of where it is in the realm of reality.
Just to throw out a little factoid here that I can't claim credit for, and I can't even remember who I heard it from. I think it was a guy named John Foster, who's like an ecological Marxist. He pointed out that in 2008, which I'm sure seems like ancient history to everyone in the class, when the government did this gigantic bailout of the banks, they could have taken that same amount of money and paid off the mortgage of every single person who owned a home in the United States, but they didn't do that. They instead did this top-down thing. But the point is, we've got huge amounts of money when we want to use it. You know, somehow we find that money when we think it's really necessary. So yeah, we could be having real discussions about reparations. It's not about it being impossible. It's about political will.
Jenna, do you know Kara Pike? She's a climate communicator. She runs an organization called Climate Access. I had her in my communications class earlier today, and she was sort of, putting forward this notion that she's never actually experienced more readiness to sort of address climate change than during this pandemic. She said, you imagine that, there's like finite worry, people are absorbed with this, but she says, no, this is like a moment when people are rethinking everything. And it's a moment when values really can change in ways that they can't at other moments, that this is a lot more of an opportunity than people may realize. And I think with Black Lives Matter and what we've been experiencing lately, I feel like on a number of fronts, this could be, I'm not saying it is, but it certainly could be a real turning point in people's thinking on so many of these issues,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's at least some voices speaking for finding common ground on things, which is another hopeful aspect for me.
Yeah, in the face of extreme polarization, yeah, I think, you never know what prepares you for change, I don't think,
Right.
And exactly as you were talking about your experience with marches and like, what are the marches for? And we imagine that they're fundamentally political. They're about like, they're a mechanism for political change, but there are a lot of other things going on,
Mm-hmm. Any last thoughts from the class? I can see the thoughtful faces. It's like really obvious. You can tell, you get used to, once you've been teaching long enough, you start to notice when people are zoned out on Zoom.
I kind of am interested in the connection between being isolated and being more aware of environmental issues, or being more willing to want to do something.
John, can
Because
you-
like being alone and being more individually like present instead of around people all the time, what that does. It's interesting.
John, can you follow up on that at all, since it was your speaker?
Adriana, I see that more as like a comment than something I can really respond to. I don't know, I just don't know what the meaning of where we are, but I feel like it's like when you're really in the thick of something, I think it's not always possible to know its meaning, but
That's where I meant like it would be a good study, or like,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
so.
Yeah. And people, yeah, I mean, we can speculate that, like people's desire for connection, and for positive, for like having positive, constructive actions that we can do when we've been so isolated for so long. Okay. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Jenna, I just want to thank you so much. It's always great to have you in class, and I hope, we do sort of samplings of things in this class because it's, it is an intro class, but I think hopefully today gives you like a little bit of a sense of, among other things, what Jay's classes are like. I'm forever stuck in calling Jay Janet because that's how I.
And I'm teaching this summer. First years won't. Well, the first years won't be there, but if you have sophomores, I'll be teaching this summer, so I'll be around.
But Jay's not going anywhere long term, so for those of you who are first years, you've got opportunities. And again, I want to thank Jay for sharing with us, and hope you guys spend some time thinking about this afterwards too. So
thanks everyone.
Janet.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.